Imagine a bright summer afternoon in an upscale neighborhood of Los Angeles. Jake Harris, a former military operative with 20 years of service, had finally achieved his dream. After years of saving and relentless hard work, he had purchased his dream home, a stunning two-story villa with a crystal-clear swimming pool that shimmered under the California sun. But his peaceful moment was about to be shattered. As Jake lounged on his chair, enjoying the warm breeze, the sudden wail of police sirens ripped through the tranquility. Two patrol cars screeched to a halt in front of his gate. Officers, hands hovering over their holstered weapons, approached his fence. "Sir, we received a report about an intruder in the pool area." Jake sat up abruptly, an uneasy feeling creeping into his chest. He knew exactly who had made the call. From the corner of his eye, he spotted his neighbor, Linda Thompson, peeking from behind her curtains, a satisfied smirk on her face. This wasn't the first time she had done this, but this time would be the last. 2 months earlier. Jake stepped proudly through the doors of his new home, a gorgeous villa in an exclusive neighborhood. 20 years of service had finally given him something his parents had never been able to afford. A place to call his own. A stable home after a lifetime of constant relocations. From the moment he first saw the house, the backyard pool had been the highlight. The crystal-clear water reflected the golden afternoon sunlight, creating a picture-perfect scene. He imagined peaceful mornings sipping coffee by the pool, relaxing evenings after long days. But he had no idea that his peace would soon be disrupted. As he arranged the outdoor furniture, an unsettling sensation crept into his mind. The distinct feeling of being watched. Looking up at the second floor of the house next door, he saw a woman standing behind a large window. Her platinum blonde hair was meticulously styled, her face heavily made up, a phone pressed to her ear. But her eyes never left him. Jake gave a polite wave. Instead of returning the gesture, she immediately pulled the curtains shut, vanishing from sight. A bad feeling settled in his gut. The next day, while Jake was at a hardware store picking up supplies for the house, his phone buzzed. A notification from his security camera system popped up. Movement detected in the backyard. He quickly opened the app and checked the live feed. What he saw made his blood boil. The woman from yesterday, now appearing to be in her 50s, was casually strolling through his unlocked backyard gate. Dressed in an expensive designer swimsuit, a high-end towel draped over her arm, she walked with the confidence of someone who owned the place. Without hesitation, she laid the towel on a lounge chair, removed her sunglasses, and dipped her feet into the water. Jake tightened his grip on his phone. He couldn't believe the audacity. He turned his car around and drove straight home. When he arrived, she was still there, flipping through a fashion magazine like she was at a luxury resort. He walked straight to the backyard. "Excuse me, but what exactly are you doing in my yard?" His voice was calm but firm. The woman looked up, feigning surprise, then placed a hand on her chest as if deeply offended. "Oh dear, I thought you were the new pool maintenance guy," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The previous owner always let me use the pool." Jake crossed his arms, eyes locked onto hers. "Ma'am, I'm not the pool guy. I'm the new owner of this house, and I believe you should have asked before trespassing." Her expression flickered for a split second before regaining its usual haughty composure. "You? The owner?" She let out a soft chuckle, as if he had just told the most ridiculous joke. "There must be some mistake. I know the real estate agents who sold this house, and they never mentioned, She trailed off, leaving an unspoken implication hanging in the air. Jake held his ground. "There's no mistake, Linda," he said, deliberately emphasizing her name. She flinched slightly. "This is my house, and you are trespassing. I need you to leave immediately." Linda pursed her lips, muttering something under her breath as she gathered her belongings. But before walking away, She turned back to him with a challenging glare. "We'll see how this plays out." Jake stood still, watching as she stepped through the gate and disappeared into her house. He let out a sigh, sensing that this wouldn't be the last time he'd have to deal with this woman, and just as he suspected, this was far from over. After their first confrontation, Jake had hoped that Linda would understand the issue and not repeat her actions. But he was wrong. Just a few days later, on a Saturday morning, he woke up to the sound of loud chatter and splashing water. A bad feeling crept over him as he sat up and pulled back the bedroom curtains. The scene before him left him stunned. Linda hadn't just come back. This time, she had brought company. 6 women, all dressed in expensive swimsuits, were lounging with glasses of wine, laughing and swimming in his pool as if they were on a luxury vacation. Jake narrowed his eyes, gripping the window frame tightly. Unacceptable. He marched into the backyard, his voice low and cold. "Ladies, you need to leave immediately. This is private property." Linda didn't even bother turning to look at him. She lazily waved a hand, dismissing him as if he were an annoying fly. "Oh, don't be so uptight," she said, her voice sickly sweet but laced with arrogance. "We're just having a little fun. It's not like you ever use this pool." Some of her friends began to look uneasy. One of them whispered hesitantly, "Linda said we had permission." Jake took a deep breath. "Linda, this is my final warning. Next time, I'm calling the police." Linda finally turned to face him, a smirk curling on her lips. "Go ahead," she said, eyes glinting with challenge. "I know the police chief personally." Jake studied the woman before him, realizing this wasn't just simple entitlement. This was a game Linda was sure she would win. But what she didn't know was that he wasn't the kind of man who backed down. If Linda wanted to play, Jake would play to win. She folded her arms, her smirk widening with confidence. "Call them, Jake. I know the police chief and half the officers in this town. Think about it. What can a newcomer like you really do? I've lived here for over 15 years. You're just passing through." Jake didn't react to the provocation. Instead, he pulled out his phone, dialed 911, and said calmly, "This is Jake Matthews. I'd like to report trespassing at my property." Linda scoffed. "Oh, come on. Do you really think they'll come out here for this? They have better things to do than listen to some ex-military guy whining." Jake held the phone to his ear, his eyes locked onto Linda. When the dispatcher asked for details, he replied firmly, "The trespasser has entered my property without permission. This isn't the first time. I have security footage and will provide it as evidence." Linda was still smiling, but her confidence wavered slightly at the unwavering tone in Jake's voice. A moment later, he ended the call and met her gaze. "They're on their way." Linda crossed her arms, trying to regain her composure. "Fine. Let's see if they even care about something this trivial." Jake said nothing, just stood his ground and waited. She might believe she held all the power here, but Jake knew one thing. He wasn't easily intimidated. 15 minutes later, the sound of tires rolling onto the pavement signaled the arrival of the police. Linda raised an eyebrow, flashing a smug smile, as if she had already proven her point. The car door opened, and a middle-aged officer stepped out, removing his sunglasses as he surveyed the scene. Linda immediately waved, her voice dripping with familiarity. "Billy, I knew it would be you." "Chanu." Jake remained composed, but he had already anticipated this. Linda wasn't bluffing. She really did know people in the department. But that didn't mean he was about to back down. Billy glanced at Linda, then turned to Jake with a measured look. "Jake Matthews?" "That's me," Jake said, folding his arms. Billy nodded and stepped forward, his voice steady. "I got a call about trespassing." "Correct," Jake replied, "and I want this handled by the law." Linda immediately cut in, her voice syrupy. "Oh, Billy, come on! You know I didn't mean any harm. I've been using this pool for years. The previous owner allowed me. How was I supposed to know our new friend here was so strict about it?" Billy sighed, rubbing his temples as if this was an unnecessary headache. "Linda, I've known you a long time, but you have to understand what's his is his." He turned to Jake, his tone level. "Look, I don't want to turn this into a criminal case. You're neighbors. Is there any way to settle this amicably?" Jake narrowed his eyes. "Amicably? Are you suggesting I let her keep trespassing?" "No, no," Billy said, raising a hand. "I just think this might be a misunderstanding. Maybe Linda was just used to the way things were before and hasn't adjusted to the new ownership." Linda nodded eagerly. "Exactly. I'm more than happy to have a friendly discussion and work something out." Jake glanced at her, then back at Billy. "Friendly? After she's blatantly invaded my property, thrown a party without asking, and ignored my warnings. If I hadn't called the police today, how many more times would this continue?" Billy sighed again. "I see your point, Jake. But are you sure you want to escalate this to a criminal charge? If you file an official complaint, it'll go on record." Jake fell silent for a moment. He understood Billy's implication. A legal case could make things messier. Jake stood still, watching as she stepped through the gate and disappeared into her house. He let out a deep sigh, sensing that this wouldn't be the last time he had to deal with this woman. And just as he predicted, this was far from over. After their first encounter, Jake had hoped Linda would understand and not repeat her actions. But he was wrong. Just a few days later, on a Saturday morning, he woke up to the sound of loud chatter and splashing water. A bad feeling surged through him. He got up quickly and yanked open his bedroom curtains. The sight before him made his jaw tighten. Linda hadn't just returned. This time, she had brought company. 6 women, all dressed in expensive swimsuits, were lounging by his pool, sipping wine, and laughing as if they were on a luxury vacation. Jake narrowed his eyes, gripping the window frame. Unacceptable. He stormed into the backyard, his voice calm but ice-cold. "Ladies, you need to leave immediately. This is private property." Linda didn't even bother to turn around. She lazily waved a hand as if swatting away a pesky fly. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness and condescension. "We're just having a little fun. It's not like you ever use this pool." Some of the women exchanged uneasy glances. One of them whispered, "Linda said we had permission." Jake took a deep breath. "Linda, this is my final warning. Next time, I'm calling the police." Linda finally turned to face him, a smirk playing at her lips. "Go ahead," she taunted. "I know the police chief personally." Jake locked eyes with her, sensing that this wasn't just arrogance, it was a challenge. Linda believed she was untouchable, but what she didn't know was that he wasn't someone who backed down easily. If Linda wanted to play, Jake would play. She crossed her arms, exuding confidence. "Call them, Jake. I know the police chief and half the officers in town. What do you think you can do? You're new here. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 15 years. You're just passing through." Jake didn't react to the provocation. He pulled out his phone, dialed 911, and spoke calmly. "This is Jake Matthews. I'd like to report a trespassing incident at my property." Linda scoffed. "Oh, come on. Do you really think they'll bother with this? They have more important things to do than listen to some ex-military guy complain." Jake held the phone to his ear, his gaze never leaving hers. When the dispatcher asked for details, he replied firmly, "The intruder entered my property without permission. This isn't the first time. I have security footage and am willing to provide it." Linda's smug expression wavered slightly. A moment later, Jake hung up and looked her straight in the eye. "They're on their way." Linda folded her arms again, masking her slight hesitation with a chuckle. "Fine. Let's see if they actually care about something this trivial." Jake didn't respond. He simply waited. She could believe she had influence, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated. 15 minutes later, the sound of tires crunching on pavement signaled the arrival of law enforcement. Linda arched an eyebrow, a slow smile creeping onto her face like she had just proven a point. The car door opened, and a middle-aged officer stepped out, removing his sunglasses as he surveyed the scene. Linda immediately waved, her voice cheerful, like greeting an old friend. "Billy, I knew you'd be the one to come." Jake remained composed, but internally he had already anticipated this. Linda wasn't bluffing. She truly had connections, but that didn't mean he was backing down. Billy looked at Linda, then at Jake, his expression neutral. "Jake Matthews?" "That's me," Jake replied, arms crossed. Billy nodded and stepped closer, his tone even. "I received a call about trespassing." "Correct," Jake said, "and I want this handled properly." Linda immediately interjected, her voice syrupy. "Oh, Billy, you know me. I didn't mean any harm. I've used this pool for years. The previous owner allowed me. How was I supposed to know he'd be so uptight about it?" Billy sighed, rubbing his temples like this was an unnecessary headache. "Linda, I've known you a long time, but you have to understand. His house, his rules?" He turned to Jake, his voice measured. "Look, I don't want to escalate this into a criminal matter. You're neighbors. Can we resolve this peacefully?" Jake narrowed his eyes. "Peacefully? You're asking me to let her continue trespassing?" "No, no," Billy waved a hand. "I just think this might be a misunderstanding. Maybe Linda got too comfortable with the old arrangement and hasn't adjusted to a new homeowner." Linda eagerly nodded. "Exactly. I'm more than happy to talk this out like reasonable adults." Jake stared at her, then at Billy. "Reasonable? After she broke into my property, threw a party, and ignored my warnings. If I hadn't called you, she'd be planning the next one right now." Billy sighed again. "I understand your frustration, Jake, but are you sure you want to push this into an official complaint? If you file charges, it'll go on record." Jake was silent for a moment. He understood Billy's point. Pressing charges could complicate things. Linda seized the opportunity, crossing her arms as if she were the victim. "Jake, I admit, I may have gone a little overboard. I take responsibility, okay? Can't we just drop this? I won't use your pool again. Let's call it even." Jake stared at her, distrust clear in his eyes. He didn't believe her for a second, but he also knew that if he pushed too hard, she might retaliate in another way. Finally, he took a slow breath. "Fine, I won't press charges, but if you step onto my property again, I won't just call the police. I'll take action." Linda beamed. "Great. I knew we could settle this like adults." Billy nodded. "Thanks, Jake. If you have any more issues, just let me know." Linda turned, leading her friends away, but before leaving she glanced back with a smirk. "Oh, and Jake, don't take things too seriously. Good neighbors should be willing to compromise." Jake didn't reply, his hands clenching into fists. He knew one thing for certain. Linda wasn't done, and neither was he. That afternoon, Jake installed extra security cameras. He had a plan. Linda thought he was unaware of what she did when he wasn't home. But Jake wasn't the kind of man to sit back and tolerate nonsense. He had spent 20 years in the military, trained to gather intelligence and execute countermeasures flawlessly. Once his surveillance system was in place, he started tracking Linda's habits. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays. Those were her days. The days when Jake left early and returned late due to work. The days when Linda lurked around his property like a vulture circling its prey. On Wednesday, she tried fitting an old key into his back gate, likely from the previous owner. But Jake had changed every lock on day one. She failed, but she didn't give up. On Thursday, security footage captured her sneaking into his backyard, sprinkling something into the soil of his vibrant red rose bushes. Under the dim morning light, her fingers discreetly scattered a toxic powder. Weed killer. Within days, his carefully nurtured flowers would wither. On Friday, she didn't enter. She simply stood at a distance, staring at his house. studying, planning. But the final straw came that evening when Jake returned home. The moment he stepped into his backyard, he froze. His once crystal-clear pool had transformed into a foamy white abyss. Bubbles frothed over the edge, an acrid chemical scent burning his nostrils. Jake crouched down, running his fingers through the suds. Soap, a massive amount of detergent, had been dumped into the water, threatening to destroy his filtration system. An expensive repair. He clenched his jaw. No need to guess the culprit. Pulling out his phone, he checked the security footage. Sure enough, there she was, Linda, sneaking in, pouring in the detergent, then standing back, admiring her handiwork like a mischievous child. Jake smirked coldly. If Linda wanted to mess with his pool, he would make sure she'd never forget it. That afternoon, Jake installed additional security cameras. He had a plan. Linda thought he had no idea what she did when he wasn't home. But Jake wasn't the kind of man to sit back and tolerate things. He had spent 20 years in the military, trained to gather intelligence and execute counter-strategies flawlessly. After setting up the enhanced surveillance system, he started tracking Linda's schedule. And very quickly a pattern emerged. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Those were her days. On those days, Jake always left early in the morning and didn't return until late at night for work. And every time he was away, Linda would lurk around his house like a vulture, circling its prey as the mind games begin. At first, it was small things. On Wednesday morning, Jake stepped onto his porch to grab the newspaper, only to find it missing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a simple mistake. Linda had collected it first. The camera caught her walking up, bending down to pick up the paper, flipping through a few pages, then shrugging as if it rightfully belonged to her. That afternoon, when Jake got home, he noticed his mailbox was wide open. The contents inside, bills, personal letters, were all shuffled around. Some envelopes had their edges torn, as if someone had tried to peek inside. On Thursday, before sunrise, Linda crept up to his front door and slipped a piece of paper onto the doorknob. When Jake picked it up, he realized it was a fake parking violation ticket, filled with ridiculous spelling errors. Linda was trying to get under his skin with petty tricks. Later that day, the cameras caught her standing in front of his house, glancing around before tipping over his trash bin, spilling its contents all over the walkway. But the final straw came on Friday night, when Jake returned home after a long day. The moment he stepped into his backyard, he froze. His pool, usually crystal clear, had transformed into a foaming, bubbling mess. The thick layer of suds covered the entire surface, spilling over the edges. A sharp chemical scent hit his nose, and he immediately knew something was wrong. He stepped forward, reached down, and ran his fingers through the foam. It was soapy. A massive amount of detergent had been dumped into the pool, overloading the filtration system. If left unattended, it could completely ruin the pump, forcing him to replace the entire water treatment system. A costly fix. Jake clenched his fists. He didn't need to guess who was behind this. Pulling out his phone, he accessed the security footage. As expected, the video showed Linda sneaking into his backyard that afternoon, carrying a large bottle of concentrated cleaner. She casually unscrewed the cap, poured the entire thing into the pool, then crossed her arms and watched with a satisfied smirk, like a child admiring their latest prank. Jake stared at the foamy disaster before him. Then slowly, a cold smile crept onto his face. If Linda wanted to mess with his pool, then he'd make sure she got an unforgettable experience in return. White foam covered the water's surface, reeking of chemicals and spilling over the pool's edge. A massive amount of detergent had been dumped in, putting the filtration system at risk of severe damage. Jake was no longer angry. Instead, he smiled coldly. If Linda enjoyed messing with his pool, then he would make sure she had an experience she would never forget. Jake didn't rush to retaliate. He was a soldier. He knew the value of patience. Rather than reacting impulsively, he did his research. Recently, during a conversation with a friend in the biochemical industry, he had come across something interesting, a special kind of biological dye. It was completely safe, non-toxic, and invisible in water, but when it came into contact with certain chemicals, it would cling to the skin for days. The best part? It only reacted with compounds found in high-end cosmetics. Jake smirked. Linda and her clique were obsessed with luxury beauty products. Without hesitation, he ordered the dye from a specialized lab. It was completely harmless, causing no irritation. But once it stuck, it would take at least a week to fade. And the color Jake chose? Bright green. That evening, he carefully introduced the dye into the pool's filtration system. The liquid was transparent in water, only activating when it touched skin coated in expensive makeup. He double-checked his security cameras, ensuring everything was in place. Then, he went about his routine as if nothing had happened, leaving his house on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, just as usual, and just as he expected. Jake didn't react immediately. He knew Linda was always looking for loopholes and wouldn't give up easily. So, he laid a little bait. One morning, while pretending to talk on the phone with a security consultant friend, he made sure to speak loud enough for Linda to overhear from her yard. "Yeah, my security cameras have been glitching lately. Sometimes they go offline for hours. I'm waiting for a technician to fix them." Then he casually walked away, pretending not to notice the way Linda perked up. That very night, she called her friends, her voice brimming with excitement. "That soldier's pool is still ours. His cameras are down. He won't see a thing. This weekend, we party like usual." Jake heard it all through his audio surveillance, but didn't react. He just smirked to himself. The next morning, right after Jake drove away, the backyard gate creaked open. Linda and her 6 friends slipped in like seasoned trespassers. One by one, they moved swiftly, carrying designer bags and draping silk scarves over their shoulders. "I told you, he gave up," Linda whispered, a triumphant smirk on her lips. "So what if he's a soldier? He's just a lonely bachelor in the end." Another woman chuckled, pouring champagne. "Well, at least we have a place to unwind every week." Linda laughed heartily, confidently unwrapping her scarf and stretching out her arms like a queen claiming new territory. "All right, ladies, time to enjoy ourselves." And with that, she jumped into the pool. The others followed suit, splashing into the crystal-clear water. For a few blissful moments, the pool shimmered under the garden lights, ripples catching the golden glow of sunset. Linda surfaced first, wiping water from her face with a satisfied grin. But the peace lasted only a second. A green hue began spreading across her skin. Her eyes widened in horror. Sarah looked down at her hands and shrieked, "What the hell is this?" Her once fair skin was now a vibrant shade of green, like a chameleon blending into a tropical rainforest. Around her, the other women screamed in panic as they scrambled out of the water, dripping wet, their faces twisted in shock. Their expensive makeup melted down their cheeks, turning them into grotesque, smudged caricatures. "I have an important meeting tomorrow," one of them wailed, staring at her stained hands in despair. Linda, now glowing in a deep jade green from head to toe, clenched her teeth in fury. She spun around, eyes darting frantically, searching for the culprit behind this humiliating prank. And then she saw it. A tiny security camera mounted on the wall, its red light blinking mockingly. The chaos escalated as 6 green-streaked women bolted from the garden, leaving the pool behind like a crime scene painted in neon hues. They dashed across the street, dripping water and leaving bright green footprints on the pavement. That night, social media exploded. Jake, ever the meticulous planner, had edited the security footage into a masterpiece, starting with Linda's illegal break-in, followed by the grand green transformation, all set to dramatic opera music. Within hours, the video had millions of views. Local news outlets pounced on the story. Linda and the Trespasser squad turned into chameleons. The headlines screamed across platforms. The online community was ecstatic. People who had suffered under Linda's entitled behavior flooded the comment sections with their own stories. She once yelled at my kid for drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. Remember when she tried to ban dogs in the neighborhood just because she hated barking? Linda's real estate company couldn't ignore the backlash. Their social media was overrun with sarcastic comments and an endless flood of green emojis. By Monday, they released an official statement. We do not condone any form of trespassing. Recent events do not reflect the values of our company. But the damage was done. Linda attempted to salvage her reputation with a personal video, but under the harsh lighting, her emerald-stained skin made her look less like a victim and more like a villain straight out of a Disney movie. I was just trying to maintain the neighborhood's civility, Linda insisted. But instead of sympathy, the internet turned her into a meme, an enraged green goblin. The more she struggled, the deeper she sank. When Linda's lawyer sent a cease and desist letter demanding that Jake take down the video, his response was simple: a compilation of her trespassing incidents along with a police report. The legal battle ended shortly after that. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood took a turn for the better. Those who had once stayed silent under Linda's control now found themselves growing close. Mrs. Martinez, who had been scolded by Linda for hosting family gatherings, brought over freshly baked pastries to thank Jake. The Wilsons, once sued by Linda for leaving bicycles in their driveway, now chatted freely with their neighbors. Even Linda's former friends began to distance themselves from her, partly out of embarrassment, partly because they still had stubborn green stains lingering on their skin. But the final blow came from Linda's own husband. I can't even take her to meet clients without someone asking, "Is she okay?" he complained to his golf buddies. And then, just as expected, a for sale sign appeared in front of Linda's house. As the moving truck pulled away, Jake simply raised his glass of lemonade, not to celebrate her departure, but to savor the peace he had reclaimed for the neighborhood. 1 year later, Jake's pool had become the heart of the community. Parties were now held regularly, properly organized, filled with laughter, and free from unnecessary drama. A new family had moved into Linda's old house, a young couple with 2 playful kids, who quickly blended in with the neighborhood. Every now and then, visitors would pause, curious about the small framed picture hanging near the pool entrance. A group of people scrambling out of the water, their skin bright green. Jake would simply smile and say, "Karma spares no one,"